it answers that question of, does feeding the same amount of carbs but breaking it into 4 smaller feeds or 2 larger feeds, does it make a difference? Well, I think the answer was pretty clear that no, it didn't.
Welcome to Fuel In Sessions, the podcast that dives into the science of fueling smarter and performing better. Powered by Fuel In, the AI-driven nutrition app for endurance athletes. We're here to share expert insights, training tips and strategies to help you fuel your best and reach your peak performance. My name's Scott Tyndall, Chief Nutrition Officer of Fuel In, and today I'm joined by none other, can't even speak, Dr. Alan McCubbin. Alan, how are you doing?
Good, mate. Good to be back.
Very good, mate. I'm looking forward to this one. It's a short, sharp one, but as we try and do every month, we dive into a science paper. We used to do 2, but we've cut it down to 1 just because we always go a little bit into the weeds. Mate, this one's a good one. I think everyone will find this paper and what we're going to talk about today very relevant to them, and certainly very relevant to Fuel In users, because we do talk about carbohydrates or not. We do encourage carbohydrate capacity testing within Fuel In and athletes understanding their carbohydrate intake requirements and the practical ways to do it. So, I think it's going to be a great one. So without further ado, I'm going to give the title of the study, which is Different Carbohydrate Ingestion Patterns Do Not Affect Physiological Responses, Whole Body Substrate Oxidation, or Gastrointestinal Comfort in Cycling. This was published in the European Journal of Sports Science, 2025, lead author being Robin Owen-Jones, and there were a number of other investigators along with that. What it did look at was 90 grams an hour of carbohydrate taken as either 22.5 grams every 15 minutes or 45 grams every 30 minutes during 180 minutes of cycling at lactate threshold 1, followed by a time to exhaustion test. I know that's a lot to get for everyone to get their head around initially, and we will put the link in the notes. But very top level, Al, what does it mean from like a practical insights? What did this study give us?
Yeah, well, essentially it's looking at a really practical question, which is what I like about it. And it's basically saying, well, you can have however many grams of carbohydrate per hour you want, whether it's 60 grams, whether it's 90 grams, 120, whatever it is. But basically what it's trying to say is, does it matter how you take that 90 grams or 120 grams or whatever? In this case, it was 90 grams an hour. And they're basically saying, well, can you have it all in one big hit, or in this case, 2 big hits of 45 grams each every half an hour? Or is there a difference if you kind of drip feed it in? And so for athletes, this makes sense because there are different ways, obviously, you can get your carbohydrate in. If you have it in drinks, it's probably likely to be more of a drip feed just because of the way you drink it, as opposed to taking it in gels. And particularly with some of the products now allowing you to get in a huge amount of carbohydrate in a single gel, you may have more of that, like, you get your entire hourly intake in 1 or 2 goes, as opposed to drip feeding it in over 4 or 5 goes throughout the hour. So it was really trying to explore, does it actually make a difference whether you do it one way or the other?
Okay. And there hasn't been much research on this to date. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So very little around this. Studies traditionally, I think if you look at a certain grams per hour of carbohydrate that's fed, they tend to do it in like 15-minute chunks, just because that's easier to do from a study point of view. Often the products they're using, they're not commercial products, they're making their own kind of carbohydrate mixes for those studies as well. Then it just makes sense and it's easier to do that, and trying to keep it consistent across whatever variables that they're trying to vary within that study. So yeah, it's not common that you see this type of study design.
Excellent. And high level, what did it show?
Yeah, well, I mean, the title kind of gives it away that it didn't show a lot. We'll get into all the various different variables around this, but to take a step back, I guess how did they what did they go about studying? Well, they looked at a few things that were mentioned in the title there. So they looked at the effect of these different consumption patterns on physiology, so things like heart rate, perceived exertion, blood glucose, and lactate. They looked at whether it altered the amount of carbohydrate versus fat that was used during exercise, so that kind of substrate oxidation. They looked at whether it impacts on gastrointestinal comfort during exercise, which is one of the ones where you may think there could be potentially a difference in terms of having a big lump of carbohydrate going in straight away or kind of spreading that out and trickling it in. And then they did a performance test at the end. So as you said before, they did the 3 hours at the 90% of the first lactate threshold. So I think it's important just to recognize that there are two different lactate thresholds. So the first one is not the one we kind of associate with, around that sort of FTP critical power. That's the second lactate threshold. So the first one is really kind of the bottom end of the zone, around zone 2-ish. So 90% of it is sort of towards the bottom end of zone 2, just to put that into perspective. So they're riding at 3 hours at that kind of sort of low to moderate exercise intensity. And then at the end of that, having fed that carbohydrate in one of two different ways, they then did what's called a time to exhaustion test. So basically they set the power on the bike in the lab to a certain power output. In this case, it was 150% of that first lactate threshold, which it's going to vary depending on the person, but probably in zone 5. So it's going to be well above FTP, but below VO2 max. So it's kind of in that range. And then they basically have to try and hold that power for as long as they possibly can, which was about, we'll get into the actual results shortly, but about 8 to 10 minutes. Depending on the group. So that was sort of the performance test that was done at the end of this. And that performance test may not be so relevant necessarily to events like long course triathlon, because you generally don't work at those sort of very high intensities. But it may be relevant to Olympic distance triathlon, looking at the efforts at the end, although that's usually running rather than cycling, but also very relevant to road cycling, where those kind of efforts are not uncommon, and they're often the efforts that decide the outcome of a race.
Yeah, and I think what you touched on then at the end actually is a really important point, because the population was cyclists. So just keep that in mind when we are listening to this and what we're going to discuss in terms of the outcomes for everyone, that it is based on cycling. And yes, we do have a large triathlon following and a large running following as well. But at this point in time, this is the information based on cyclists. Okay, so we got into that. Where did we get to? So you've described what was studied in terms of the ride. Did you describe the total carbohydrate intake at this point in time?
Yeah, so 90 grams an hour of carbs were consumed across that 3 hours, and then they didn't feed during the performance test. But as I said, it was over in less than 10 minutes, so that's kind of neither here nor there. And they fed that using gels. So they used a gel using a 1 to 0.8 glucose to fructose ratio. What that translates to in real world terms, I guess, is 50 grams an hour of glucose and 40 grams an hour of fructose, so 90 grams an hour when they're combined. And as you mentioned in the introduction, that was basically taken in one of two ways. So there was kind of the fed it in smaller chunks 4 times over the hour, so 22.5 grams of carbs every 15 minutes, or taken in just 2 chunks per hour, so 45 grams of carbs every 30 minutes during that 3-hour ride.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying, happy to say what gels were used in this. It was Science in Sport. It was the SIS gel. So I presume they were using it didn't actually, I don't think it said, but I'd say it was their isotonic gel for the 22.5 grams and then probably their beta fuel gel for the 45 gram. And they delivered the same volume of fluid, which was important potentially to discuss as well.
Yeah. So so the gels, I suspect they actually used the same gels and actually like opened up the packets and took out a certain amount of it and gave them to them. So the actual gels and the flavors and everything were the same.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They just took, like half a gel instead of a full gel or something like that. However, that kind of divides up. Yeah. In terms of the fluid intake, they had 150 mils of water every 15 minutes. So in other words, 600 mils an hour of water in addition to the gels throughout the 180-minute ride. They did mention at the end, because of the composition of the gels, it meant that there was a very small difference, about 120 mils an hour, I think it was off the top of my head, in terms of the total fluid intake when you combine the gels and the drinks, which makes me think actually you're right that the composition of the gels or the way they're packaged was slightly different.
Yeah. Do you think it's unusual that they were made to drink 100? Would it have been better to not force them to drink 150 mils every 15 minutes? Should it have been ad libitum, do you think?
You may get slightly different results. I guess in this case, they're doing the same power output in the same conditions. So theoretically, their sweat rate should be the same. So if you match the fluid volume, whether it was worked out based on, replacing a certain amount of sweat losses or not. It basically just means that the total fluid deficit, or the overall hydration status, will be the same in both trials, which obviously they don't want that to vary, because they want only the carbohydrate pattern of intake to be the thing that changes between the two trials.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay, so that's what they did. Measurements you described, every 15 minutes. They took heart rate, rate of perceived exertion. They did a blood glucose and lactate. I believe they stopped them and took the blood glucose and lactate measurements, so made them actually stop cycling. Is that correct?
I'm not sure.
I think they detailed that as
yeah,
well.
you can actually do those while you keep going cycling. Yeah. Obviously, running you would have to stop, but cycling you can actually do a finger prick lactate test while you're riding. It's a little bit tricky, but it can be done.
It can be done. I think I remember detailing they did stop them at the time to take those measurements. Indirect calorimetry, VO2 and substrate oxidation was recorded. GI symptoms on a 0 to 10 scale, and they also. And this was interesting, I thought. The authors said that for the first time, a taste or sweetness rating had been investigated. I find that hard to believe that that's never been done in any studies, but is that true in your
I think experience? Maybe in the context of different patterns of intake.
Okay. Yeah, because I was like, I'm sure someone would have studied sweetness and taste. But, I mean, it was interesting. And again, we'll come into what that found. Okay, so in terms of who was studied, because I think this, again, is important if you are listening to this and you are thinking, okay, how does this apply to me? Who was studied?
Yep. So there were 20 male cyclists. They describe them, there's a classification system that's been used quite broadly in research now to classify the caliber or level of athlete, if you like. They classified them as tier 1 kind of recreational athletes. From what I saw of the description of these guys, they were training at least 3 times a week. They had a VO2 max of 50 mils per kilo per minute. I would probably put them into the next level above, maybe what's called tier 2, essentially. So they're probably regularly training, but not at the top tier of their age category or anything like that. But they're certainly not complete newbies.
Yeah, I think they might be a little bit upset by that classification.
Yeah.
And it was interesting reading that, and I know we've had discussions around this because it is a classification system that we're actually introducing into Fuel In. So we're going to have these 4 classifications, which will result in us being able to default certain metrics to individuals to improve that energy prescription, which, has been that Algo V2, which has been in the works now for just over 12 months, which, we're finally starting to see and test, which I think is very exciting. And I think from the top, our classification based on that system is elite, professional, then trained, recreational, and then
I think there's a competitive level. So
competitive,
professional and elite, and then there's sort of competitive as in top of your age group, but you're not competitive in an open or elite category of the sport.
Yep.
Then you've got your people that are pushing for their kind of personal best. They're training quite regularly, but they're not winning their age categories. And then more sort of beginners or recreational. They're doing it for fun and enjoyment, or they're just starting out, kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's going to have a direct impact on things like swim threshold pace, their FTP, run threshold pace in particular, and they're things that we'll be able to default if individuals don't know that when they first join Fuel In, which I think is very exciting for estimating energy requirements.
Yeah, it's definitely going a step further in terms of personalising recommendations that we have to our athletes, both in terms of the in-session fueling, but even just the calories outside of fueling to account for the work done in the sessions as well.
Yeah, 100%. They were younger. So if you are a little bit older, obviously both you and I, it's a little bit outside. The average age was 24 plus or minus 3 years. So again, when you are listening to this information, just keep in mind that maybe it is applicable to younger athletes, although I can't imagine age would impact it too much.
I wouldn't have thought so. Yeah, I mean, it's theoretically possible, but yeah, there's nothing that I know of that would suggest that these results you would pick up, you would think that they wouldn't apply to a 40-year-old.
Yeah. What else? BMI, pretty standard, 23. So they're all healthy from a BMI perspective. As you mentioned, the VO2 max, pretty decent, not, as you say, definitely above, I'd say, beginner and recreational at 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So not super high level, but certainly applicable to, I would say, a lot of Fuel In users. So I think in terms of that, it is applicable. And then you mentioned the LT1 power was about 140 watts as well. And so that's, as you described it, 90% of that LT1, wasn't it, that they used?
Yep, correct.
Okay. And that is well below when people are thinking it's not their functional threshold power, it's actually LT1, when you start to see a rise in lactate. Is that correct?
In terms of the first rise in lactate.
The first rise in lactate.
Not the big rise in lactate.
Correct, the first rise. And they did all that. They assessed that in sort of, when they were actually assessing these individuals before starting the actual testing.
Correct.
Okay. So study design. Just explain what a randomized counterbalanced crossover design is.
Yep. So crossover trial basically means that the same participants do both. In this case, there were 2 trials, so they did both trials. So this is probably the most common kind of study design, I guess, in sports nutrition. There are certain study designs where you can't do this for various reasons. In a typical drug study, you would have this because you've got to take the medication for a long period of time. And so you can't do all of that, stop, and then take the other one for a really long period of time as well. It just doesn't work, or the effect of the first trial is going to influence the second one, which you don't want. But where you have sort of one-off acute effects, you can do both. So, your typical kind of caffeine study or carbohydrate or hydration study, they'll all have this study design. So basically means that each participant acts as their own control, which means that you can get away with much smaller numbers in your study. So often people who don't understand statistical design, particularly in crossover studies, criticize these studies and go, it only had 18 people. That's just stupid. But they don't realize that essentially it's like having 36 people because they're doing both trials in these studies. Randomized just means that the order that they did those trials in was randomized. So some of them will have done the feeding every 15-minute study first, and some of them will have done the feeding every 30-minute study first, and then they swap over, hence crossover. And the counterbalance just means that the way they do the randomization means that you have roughly the same number doing either combination of that order. So you don't end up just through random chance having, out of your 18 people having, 14 or 15 of them doing one order and the others doing the other order. And that's important, particularly for things like the performance test at the end, because you don't want what's called a trial order effect, which is basically where the participants actually learn how to do the performance test from the first one and improve it on the second one, not because of the whatever you're studying, but just because they've practiced it before.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I actually didn't know about the counterbalance crossover, the counterbalanced element of it, and that's good to know.
Mm.
Okay. In terms of the study design, I thought this was great. 24 hours pre-exercise. They had a protein intake of 2 grams per kilogram, fat of 1 gram per kilogram, and carbohydrates 8 grams per kilogram. I read that and I smiled to myself because it's pretty much exactly what we do with Fuel in terms of that carbohydrate load going into a race that lasts more than 90 minutes. So I thought that was great. And then breakfast pre-trial, they had 25 grams of protein, 5 grams of fat, and 2 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate for breakfast. And again, I smiled to myself because it's pretty much what we recommend with Fuel in for a pre-race meal. So I thought that was nice. They did no exercise. They were recommended no caffeine or alcohol 24 hours prior to the experimental trial. And the testing started 40 minutes post-breakfast, which I looked at that and I thought, oh, that's pretty tight. Would you have expected them to maybe try and delay that a little bit more?
Yes and no. I think historically, in terms of study designs, a lot of studies actually get them to do it fasted because what they're trying to do is prevent any effect of the feeding beforehand influencing then what happens during exercise. I think it's actually good that they haven't done that because this is much more like the real world. People don't go and do performance tests or a race or something fasted. It's just not what you do. In terms of the 40 minutes, look, I mean, they didn't have major gastrointestinal discomfort, so it suggests it wasn't really a problem.
Yeah.
And I think, in a study design like this, it's also a bit of a practical compromise because you don't want to be just like you bring them in, you have breakfast, and then you're kind of sitting around in the lab twiddling your thumbs waiting for 2 hours or whatever it is before you start doing the testing. it makes it a longer day for everyone involved. So I can kind of see why they did it from that perspective. And yeah, I don't think 40 minutes is unreasonable. And yeah, particularly for people training in the morning, they're probably used to eating something and then training pretty soon afterwards anyway, just for practical reasons.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think as you hit the nail on the head from a practical standpoint, getting people to wait around. But I think it's also really nice because, again, we will encourage athletes with Fuel In, look, get the meal in. And a lot of athletes worry it's less than 60 minutes or less than 2 hours. It's actually, as this study showed, they had very little GI complaints and they consumed a fairly big breakfast, 40 minutes. And whether they were quite seasoned at taking in food before exercise, I imagine they probably were, but it's a good reminder for athletes, hey, you can take in fuel before a hard or a long session or even a hard session and still not necessarily get a lot of GI complaints, which I thought was really good. Okay, we've described what they did. They did the 3-hour LT1 cycling. They were taking in a fixed 90 grams an hour, either as 22.5 grams every 15 minutes or 45 grams every 30 minutes via those gels. And just to put it in perspective, that's either 6 gels or 12 gels. And I think that's good for just people to get their head around how many gels would you have to carry if you were fueling every 15 minutes versus every 30 minutes based on this intake of 90 grams an hour.
Bearing in mind the 12 gels will be half the size. It'll be 12 half gels.
Correct.
Yeah.
But it's still managing and I guess just carrying it and can you take them along? I know personally I actually probably prefer the larger gels just because it's less to carry and less, gels to open up on the run or on the bike. So, but just something to keep in mind. And then afterwards they did the time trial to exhaustion at 150% of that LT1, which equated to about 210 watts plus or minus 40 watts, which, decent effort. Okay, main outcomes. What did we see?
Not much. I'll run through it. Spoiler alert. Well, the title kind of gave it away right at the start, didn't it? But yeah, there were no differences, like on the physiological side of things, there were no differences in heart rate. There were no differences in VO2, in lactate, in perceived effort during that 3 hours, no matter whether you took, small and frequent or bigger and less frequent. There was a slightly higher blood glucose just at the first 30 minutes in the small frequent group. And that makes perfect sense because they had their first feed at 15 minutes. So the blood glucose is already starting to rise by half an hour, whereas the other group didn't have their first feed until half an hour. So obviously they haven't had that glucose come into the system yet. So I think that was the only reason really for that difference. And then after that, they were pretty much exactly the same and there were no statistically significant differences there. In terms of the use of carbohydrate versus fat during exercise, I guess this is one that people may have assumed that there might be some differences based on the pattern of feeding. But I think, whether it's every 15, if it's every 30, it's going into your stomach, it's going to be released from the stomach at a relatively constant rate, which is why I think we haven't really seen much difference between these. So there were no significant differences in terms of carbohydrate or fat utilization in terms of the grams per minute values that you get averaged across the 3 hours as well. In terms of gastrointestinal symptoms, as you said before, they were quite low and there were no real significant differences between those two groups. So there wasn't really much to write home about there either. And then when it comes to the performance in the time to exhaustion test, so this is the one done at that 209 plus or minus 40 something watts, there were no statistically significant differences. So one group did it in 9 minutes, the other group did it in 8 minutes 25. And while you would say, well, that is 35 seconds for an 8-minute effort is quite a bit, because of the large variability from one person to the next, that's not statistically significantly different due to that large variation. So you would have to have either a much larger number of people to maybe tease out any differences there. But as you add more people, you may actually see that there wasn't that difference anyway. So that difference may have come down to be much smaller if you had a much bigger sample size.
Do you think it was, I noted that they didn't actually have all the individuals' time trial, the time to exhaustion numbers. Do you think that's odd that they didn't put it in so you could actually see how big the variation was?
Yeah, I mean, some studies they definitely report that. They did that for the fat and carbohydrate oxidation, actually, in the paper,
Yeah.
and often with the performance numbers, yeah, you do have that in there as well. So yeah, it's a bit unusual if they're not reporting that.
Yeah. Couple of things you picked up there. You mentioned the blood glucose being slightly higher in the 15 in the group that took in the more frequent intake at 30 minutes. I think what we both looked at when we looked at this study, they also had a decrease in blood glucose from rest to the first 15 minutes. And, I mentioned this, I thought it was interesting. And you're like, yeah, but that always happens. But I was like, yeah, but a lot of people don't realize that's going to occur. Can you just explain that, why you would have seen that drop?
Yeah. So as you mentioned before, these guys started exercising 40 minutes after eating a pretty big breakfast, like a large amount of carbohydrate. We're talking, about 140, 150 grams of carbohydrate at breakfast, and then 40 minutes later, they're starting to exercise. So you would expect if you followed them, finger pricked them every 10 or 15 minutes from before they ate that breakfast right through to when they started exercise, which is when they actually started measuring it. What you'd probably see is the blood glucose was rising in response to eating the breakfast, right? So you start exercise. Now, the effect that exercise has on blood glucose depends on the intensity of the exercise. So at fairly low to moderate intensities like this was, was at that 90% of LT1, that will generally have a lowering effect on blood glucose levels, because basically what it does is it sensitizes the body. It allows it to bring in glucose with less insulin, and that will lower the blood glucose that has started rising in response to the breakfast meal. If they went out and started doing an interval session, you would actually expect the opposite. You get a stress hormone response to that, and that tends to actually make blood glucose rise in response to exercise. But that's not the type of exercise that was done, at least in that first 3 hours. So the drop in blood glucose is pretty much what you would expect, or a blunting of glucose compared to the response to the meal before exercise started.
Yeah, and I think it's just one of those timely reminders. People wearing CGMs or doing their blood glucose, they see this drop and they sort of sometimes panic and think, oh my God, something bad is happening, but it's actually a natural or a normal physiological response. So I think it's always just good to highlight that. You mentioned they did talk about fat oxidation was 2 times higher as well at 180 minutes. In both conditions, the frequent feeding or the indifferent feeding, but it was still quite low. But I thought that was interesting, just showing that fat oxidation, despite carbohydrate intake, can actually double from the baseline to there. Do you have any comments about that?
Not particularly. Again, that's a pretty normal response to 3 hours of exercise. But as you said, it's doubling from a very low amount to a slightly less very low amount. So it wasn't particularly high to begin with, and it wasn't much higher at the end. But technically, it's a doubling.
Yeah. And then what else did they do? The difference, well, they described the fat oxidation as larger being in the less frequent feeding trial compared to the smaller, more frequent feeding trial. But you were saying the overall difference was in actual effect, it's what, 4.5 grams over 3 hours. So it's statistically significant, but probably not clinically or practically relevant.
Yeah, that's right. So they did another analysis. We said before that the differences in the grams per minute of oxidation wasn't different between the groups, but they also combined all those data points to look at the total amount of carbohydrate and the total amount of fat utilized during that 3 hours of that easy ride. And where they did that, they found a statistically significant difference in fat use, but not carbohydrate use across the whole 3 hours. But it amounted, as you said, to 4.5 grams of fat. So really, who cares?
What's that? Yeah, 36, 37 calories over the course of 3 hours. So yeah,
and that could just be measurement variability.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so questions this study answered. What do we take from it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it answers that question of, does feeding the same amount of carbs but breaking it into 4 smaller feeds or 2 larger feeds, does it make a difference? Well, I think the answer was pretty clear that no, it didn't, at least for this type of riding, which again was a zone 2 session. But it also didn't make a difference to the performance outcome when you did that test at the end of that long zone 2 session. So I think that's really the key takeaway here. I mean, there's still a lot more questions to answer in terms of, would it have been different if it was a much larger feed, or if the drip feeding was even more drip fed, like, every 10 minutes or something, like 6 doses every 10 minutes versus once an hour, to make those differences more extreme. Would that have made a difference? Look, I think personally, I don't think it actually would. I wouldn't expect it to, because as I said before, like, all of this is going into your stomach, and the stomach has a rate of emptying, and it's not going to vary massively. There may be slight differences between the drip feeding, but a lot of those differences will actually be, probably in this context, be determined by the fluid volume and how the fluid is consumed rather than how the carbohydrate component is consumed. And of course, they may be linked because you're drinking it you're getting your carbs in a drink mix, or they may be unlinked because you're having the gels and your fluids separately. So that's where maybe you could tease out some differences. It's probably more going to be, I would expect, around the pattern of fluid consumption rather than the pattern of carbohydrate consumption.
There is something about like a higher bolus of fluid, correct me if I'm wrong, where that can actually increase the gastric pressure. Is that correct? And then result in increased gastric emptying, or
correct.
Improved gastric emptying.
Correct. Yeah.
Which I think would be something interesting. Again, and so I think that would be interesting to see. Do you also think the intensity at which they exercise for 3 hours could have been a bit higher? And would that make a difference?
Possibly. Personally, I don't think it probably would have made a difference for the sort of things that they were studying. It'd be interesting to look at. And I think the reason that they probably chose that level is it's a level that's achievable by the participants. Like, you don't want to set the bar high enough that you start having participants who actually can't finish the protocol. Then you run into trouble there.
I guess it's one of those questions. Is that sort of LT1, is that where a lot of people would be racing, or would they be slightly higher than that? And therefore, is this carbohydrate intake and the results we see in terms of oxidation, heart rate, perceived exertion, is it relevant to, say, a race situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of, we stick with triathlon to start with. Like, a lot of long course triathlon was probably typically raced in zone 3, so between LT1 and LT2, rather than just below LT1.
Yeah.
For ultra distance type stuff, so probably, beyond Ironman and getting into like ultra running or 24-hour mountain biking or something like that, then below LT1 would be kind of what you would expect.
Yeah, for sure. So that would probably be something I'd like to see, where maybe it was just a little bit higher, maybe more at race specific sort of intensity and perceived exertion, and see if that made a difference. But as you say, may not have anyway. What else? Next steps, limitations in the study, anything that you thought could be really interesting moving forward, future studies?
Yeah, well, I mentioned before, like, obviously this was done at 90 grams an hour of carbohydrate, so they haven't sort of looked at this in higher or lower quantities of carbohydrate, so that could be interesting to have a look at. One of the other things that wasn't investigated in this study, we mentioned the carbohydrate versus fat use. That was the total carbohydrate use, and we've spoken on previous episodes about exogenous versus endogenous carbohydrate use. So endogenous being the carbohydrate that's already stored inside your body when you start exercising or is produced by your liver. The exogenous being the stuff that comes in from food and fluids during exercise. So this study wasn't able to tease out the differences in that. That might be interesting to have a look at to see if there's anything going on in terms of that interaction between the endogenous and exogenous. Again, I suspect if there was any differences here, they'd probably be pretty small, particularly with the same pattern of fluid intake. But happy to be wrong on that.
Yeah.
Obviously, there were only male participants in this particular study. I don't know, and I don't think it was mentioned whether it was open to females and they just had no one volunteer, or whether it was specifically contained to male participants. But having a look at female athletes obviously would be helpful here. Again,
I'd love to see that. I think I would really like to see that, just given what we're seeing in the literature and the controversies around female versus male. Well, not controversy, but these physiological versus practical, impact of carbohydrates in particular, and whether it around the cycle, the menstrual cycle. I would certainly love to see some females sort of reproduce this study.
Yeah. Look, I personally, like, if I had to guess what that outcome would be, I wouldn't expect it would be dramatically different or different at all to males. But you don't want to make assumptions, so you won't know until you do the study, essentially.
For sure.
Obviously, different levels, higher levels of athletes, as you said, at an intensity that's more representative of the race pace that, not necessarily elite, but certainly competitive triathletes or cyclists could maintain.
I'd love to see that tier.
Well.
I'd love to see that tier 3 sort of, just higher power numbers. Does that impact, and then we start to see that 90, maybe 120 grams an hour, which we're seeing certainly at Fuel In. We're seeing these higher caliber athletes with slightly higher power output consuming more carbohydrates. And what would the impact be, frequent versus less frequent, but larger boluses of carbohydrate? I think it would be fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess the final thing is obviously the performance metric on this is quite specific in terms of that, 150% of LT1. As I said off the top, like that's probably maybe a real world, it has real world relevance if you're a road cyclist, but probably, and maybe an Olympic distance triathlete, although that would be running rather than cycling at that stage of a race. But I think for most other sort of endurance and ultra endurance sports, it probably isn't that representative of what performance actually looks like in terms of a long sustained effort. So that's probably something else that could be looked at in that context. But this study is certainly not unique in that context. Yeah. And probably the final thing I'd add to this is obviously this study looked at, whether you feed small amounts twice an hour, 4 times an hour versus larger amounts twice an hour. One of the other patterns of intake that hasn't really been investigated a lot, but I know there's some work going on, it's not finished yet, is looking at say over that 3 hours, if you start off at like 30 grams an hour and end up at 90 grams an hour by the end of the 3 hours. So start off feeding less and then start to feed progressively more as the exercise goes on, versus starting off with feeding loss and tapering it off as exercise goes on, versus a continuous amount that's the same throughout the entire 3 hours. So that's obviously a different, completely different type of study, but it is another variable in terms of that pattern of intake that will be interesting to look at, because a lot of athletes do sort of probably underfuel the first hour to 2 hours and then ramp up the feeding later. But then the other way of looking at it might be, well, if I'm more likely to get gut issues later on during exercise, am I better to feed more early, get ahead of the game, and then kind of back it off a little bit later to minimize that risk? So again, that really hasn't been investigated thoroughly, but I know there is some work going on in that area at the moment.
Yeah, that'll be great to see when it comes out. I'm certainly of the latter category. I try and front load and just hold on for dear life as racing. But yeah, it'll be great to see some of those. Well, Al, mate, we did pretty good job. We stayed pretty close to time. I love this study, and personally, I love going through these things with you, because I certainly learn a lot, and I'm sure all the listeners have learned a lot from this. They can take out of it that maybe the pattern at which you feed yourself the carbohydrates doesn't make too much of a difference, and certainly it gives you the flexibility as an athlete to choose that feeding pattern based around the total amount that you're consuming, which I think is a good thing. Personalization gives you the flexibility, and certainly what we believe at Fuel In is not prescribing on a set sort of basis. I think everyone is an individual, and it's about finding what works for you in terms of this higher carbohydrate fueling.
Yep, for sure.
Awesome, mate. Well, until next time, I'll catch you soon.
Will do.